name is Will Costis. I'm a cardiologist and a cardiac electrophysiologist. Hypertension is something I know a fair bit about as a cardiologist, and I've also studied hypertension, although that's not my primary focus these days. I'm happy to talk with you guys about it.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you for your time. Also.
Sure, my pleasure.
Really appreciate it.
Always happy to help.
Great. So I guess I'll start. My
Sure.
questions are based off of treatment.
Okay.
So according to our textbook and other research, social support plays a major role in health choices that affect well-being. Would you agree or disagree with that, and why? If you do agree or disagree, would you like to add something to that statement or sentiment?
How could I disagree? Social support is important in all aspects of healthcare, and hypertension is no exception. You know, people with any chronic medical problem really benefit a lot when they have a supportive family who can help them remember the importance of whatever medications they're on or whatever dietary restrictions we suggest to them, or helping them to exercise or do other good behaviors like quit smoking and so forth. So having a good family support system is one of the most important things.
Okay. For someone who's doing everything right but due to heredity still develops hypertension and heart problems, what would you suggest?
Okay, so there are a lot of conditions that we see as physicians where people, older people, sometimes younger people, have a health problem through no fault of their own. Genetics plays a role in many of those, and sometimes it's just bad luck.
Oh yeah, I was saying, like it's kind of like you were saying, for someone who exercises and eats right and all of that
Oh,
stuff.
and what do you do even if you're doing all the right
yeah,
stuff?
even if you're doing all the right stuff.
Okay, so the
which is
first
still
part
not
was
good.
it's not your fault,
Okay.
especially if you're doing all the right stuff. So for hypertension, really the main cornerstones of management are, number one, make sure you see a physician who knows how to help you manage your hypertension. It's such an important public health problem in the United States that most general practitioners or internists that see patients or family practitioners know a lot about hypertension management now. So somebody with hypertension doesn't necessarily need to see a hypertension expert or a cardiologist to manage that, although in patients who have difficult to treat hypertension, that's usually a good thing to do. But so the first thing is have a physician and see them regularly. The second thing is, if you're doing all the right things with regard to exercise and eating right and not gaining too much weight and not eating too much salt and other things that can contribute to hypertension, the next cornerstone of management is medication. And usually what happens in people is we start one medicine and see how well the blood pressure can be controlled. Doing everything right, as you said, includes taking your blood pressure medicines at the same time every day, and oftentimes the management of hypertension is aided by somebody being a good detective at home. So in other words, taking your blood pressure daily, writing it down, bringing a list of blood pressures and heart rates to your physician, which will help because they only see you for half an hour or an hour in the clinic, but being able to see what the last month of blood pressures were can help them to decide, do we need to increase the dose of a medicine, do we need to try another medicine? So those are things people can do. But people that are motivated to eat right and exercise and see their doctors and take their meds as they're supposed to usually do better than everyone else.
Okay. My last question is, in addition to limited food sources, in some areas there's a limit to access to fitness centers. How would you suggest that kids and young adults in inner city areas exercise and eat right in order to prevent being overweight and developing hypertension and heart problems?
That's a really big problem. I think the first thing in the problem with access to appropriate food is that in some areas, and certainly in people with a socioeconomic status, as they call it, in other words, people that don't make quite so much money, tend to eat foods that are cheaper, which makes sense because they don't have as much income. Cheaper foods in the United States, unfortunately, are usually not as good for you as the more expensive foods. So it's harder to get fresh fruits and vegetables. People eat a lot of prepared foods. People eat a lot of canned foods, like canned soup, which has an enormous amount of sodium in it. It might be tasty, but it has a lot of salt. Sodium intake is very important in hypertension, not for everyone with hypertension, but for a large majority of people with hypertension. Limiting sodium can help them to improve their blood pressure. So when people eat a lot of very sodium heavy be prepared foods, that's hard. And so that's an important thing. I think, the more they can be educated about this and try to eat right, even uh, even within, their means, to try to get fresher food and things without so much salt, and certainly to never add salt to their food is helpful. Without access, without access to exercise fitness centers and stuff, that's a little bit harder. Also, I think people staying fit has to do, like you said, number one, with trying to eat right and not eat too much. Obesity and hypertension are very associated, so trying not to eat too much is a big problem, especially for younger people because they haven't gotten old enough to realize it's a big deal.
Yeah.
And self-control for everyone is difficult, but food's good. But portion control is a big thing. So especially as you guys get older, you're just in college now, but trust me, your metabolisms will slow down as you get older, and you won't, when you start working, you might not have enough time to exercise as you do right now. And so for the same amount of food, your weight will go up. So number one, to try to stay exercising, and you don't need a fancy gym to exercise. Walking is very, very good exercise for people. Walking upstairs is even better exercise for people. And those are things that you can do without.
I'll go next.
Sure.
So African Americans have a higher incidence rate of small vessel strokes and ischemic strokes.
Uh-huh.
So why are African Americans more prone to these type of strokes as compared to others?
That's a good question. I'm not a stroke specialist, but I would suspect that there's a few reasons for that. Number one is African Americans, especially younger African Americans, have more difficulty with obesity and with hypertension than other ethnic groups. It's also true that sometimes, for a variety of factors, some of them genetic, some of them socioeconomic, like you were saying, it's a little harder to treat hypertension in African Americans. So hypertensive heart disease and also other sequelae of hypertension, like small vessel strokes and ischemic strokes, all of those things go together. So I think the root cause of that probably is a little bit genetics and probably maybe not as good access to care and treatment of their hypertension.
Okay, awesome. And so what do you think can be done to improve the inadequate diagnosis of hypertension?
I think the first thing is that people need to have access to pretty good medical care. I know our president is working pretty hard to try to fix that, even though there's a lot of people working against him, which is unfortunate. I think universal health care hopefully will come to our country soon, within the next 10 years, I really hope. But without getting too much into the politics of this and just staying on the medicine side, seeing a doctor regularly is important. Young, healthy people tend not to go to the doctor too much because they're young and healthy and they feel fine. Hypertension can be underdiagnosed in people who are young and otherwise feeling fine because, why should I go to a doctor? I'm doing everything I want. I don't have any problems. And then sometimes people can have undiagnosed hypertension for several years or longer without knowing. So not that people who are young and healthy need to go to the doctor all the time, but to have a yearly physical, I think, is a good thing. And being able to have their blood pressure checked at least once a year or twice a year is probably a good thing. Once the hypertension is detected, then we go into that pathway that we talked about before, where the physician can give them good advice about diet, exercise, and if they do need medications, which ones are good.
I know that chronic kidney disease and renal failure is also associated with hypertension.
Yeah.
So with a person that has a family history of kidney disease, for example,
right,
and they haven't yet developed hypertension, what recommendations do you have for them in order to avoid?
I don't think my recommendations would be too different.
Mm.
The first part, this isn't exactly what you're asking, but I might as well tell you that the relationship between hypertension and chronic kidney disease is bidirectional. People can get chronic kidney disease from hypertension, okay? But a variety of different chronic kidney diseases can then in turn cause hypertension. So it's a little bit interesting for us to figure out a chicken and an egg problem in some people. But anyone with a family history of chronic kidney disease, I don't know that we're quite ready to say that they should be screened earlier for hypertension because I don't think there's very good evidence for that yet.
Mm-hmm.
But I would then probably default back to what our suggestions were for just good health care.
Right.
Just make sure you see a doctor at least yearly, and then once they start to see if there's a kidney problem or if there's a hypertension problem, then to go through all those other things.
Okay, awesome.
Hypertension is commonly associated with being more common as one ages.
Yes, yes.
However, there's been growing recognition that hypertension isn't just limited to how one ages.
Yep.
More so that there's a race factor involved. How
Yep.
true do you think this is based on your experiences?
It's absolutely true, and it's been studied, and not just based on my own experience, but the experience of physicians studying thousands of people. The most common cause of hypertension is something called essential hypertension, which is basically a fancy way to say we don't know why. And genetic factors play a big role in that, and some of them are probably also related to ethnicity as well. Independent of the increase in blood pressure that we get as we age, which you mentioned, those factors do play a role, especially, of course, among the younger people. And I think we touched also with one of your colleagues over here on the fact that management of blood pressure with medicines may be different, or at least the initial management of blood pressure may be different based on ethnicity, because in large studies it seems that different ethnicities may respond a little bit better or a little bit worse to one type of medicine or another. One of the things that I haven't gotten to yet, which is important, is sometimes, and not infrequently, when people have blood pressures that are too high to be managed on a single blood pressure medicine, people can need 2 medicines, 3 medicines, sometimes even more than that to control their hypertension, especially as they get older. When people need many medications, it's something called drug-resistant hypertension or drug-refractory hypertension. That can become a big problem. And then the kinds of guides that I was talking about before, where maybe you would pick one agent first for an African American patient versus a Caucasian or an Asian patient, start to matter a little bit less when you're already throwing 3 or 4 different medicines at them to try to control their blood pressure. But at least as an initial strategy, I think it's a good one. Oh, and just to finish that, since we're talking about essential hypertension, that's most hypertension is essential hypertension. The small group of people get high blood pressure or hypertension from another cause. Some of it is renovascular hypertension, so kidney disease can cause hypertension. And there's a variety of other much more rare and more esoteric things. Tumors can cause hypertension of certain types. But most of the hypertension it's kind of a cop-out, but we call it essential hypertension. In other words, it's there, it's just that, we don't know why. And finally, the other thing which I don't think
According to statistics, the rates of getting hypertension have increased over the last couple of years.
Sure.
Until nearly 30% of the population having it today.
Yeah.
Why do you think that's the case?
I think there's a couple of reasons there. I think one of you guys, I think it was you, was talking about diet. And we have an obesity epidemic in this country. Probably in some other countries too, but it's worse in the United States. And I think that's because there's access to a lot of cheap and not so healthy food. And I think people are doing things that aren't involving as much exercise as they should. Not necessarily just video games and stuff, but even people that are doing work or whatever, that sit at a computer all day, that's not super helpful to your health. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is there's probably been an increase in the diagnosis of hypertension. Number one, there's more awareness that it's a problem, and people are going to the doctor more often, and therefore, if more people go to the doctor, you find more people with high blood pressure. So that's responsible for some part of the increase too. And finally, this is a little bit subtle, is that the definition of hypertension has changed over the last 10, 15 years, where we are now calling people with lower and lower blood pressures hypertensive, because we realize that having blood pressures that we used to think were not so bad, and we now know actually cause hypertensive heart disease and strokes and renal disease and all that other stuff, the guidelines for the definition and the treatment of hypertension have slowly but surely brought the cutoff line for the diagnosis lower and lower. And that's another reason that there's more diagnosis simply because we've moved the goalpost, so to speak.
So you pretty much covered majority of some of my questions.
Sorry, I didn't mean to do
That's
that.
fine. I'll just, I guess, kind of like briefly ask it. But so psychosocial factors have been demonstrated to be positively associated with the incidence of hypertension in African Americans. Due to these factors, how often do you witness an effect on health-related behaviors in patients diagnosed with hypertension? So we already touched on dietary choices and physical activity, but I also have like alcohol consumption.
Yeah, alcohol consumption can be a factor. I'm trying to think of psychosocial factors that affect hypertension in particular. Not simply focusing on African Americans, but different ethnic groups have historically had different attitudes towards medical care in general. And in some populations, in certain ethnic groups, and more so, I like to use the term socioeconomic groups because it may not just be the ethnic group, it may be if people don't have any money because the jobs are not good or the jobs are not available, that limits their access to healthcare. But historically, there have been attitudes of mistrust of medical providers because of bad things that happened in the past. I don't know that we need to get into all of that, but it's been pretty well documented. There were some horrible things done in this country over the last couple of 100 years. And some of them, even like the Tuskegee incident that you guys may have read about, had led to a lot of mistrust among certain ethnic groups and the medical establishment. I don't think in the last few years that we've seen that as much, as we're now in a more modern age with, the world in our country is not perfect yet, but there's a lot more information out there that people have access to with the television and with the internet, that I think there's more trust, especially among the younger people. But certainly in older people, in a variety of socioeconomic groups, not so much for blood pressure, I think, but for people with cancer, for example.
So one more question. Studies indicate that African Americans have a relatively high prevalence of poor sleep quality in comparison to members of other racial and ethnic groups. Do you believe that interventions that ameliorate poor sleep quality might reduce the incidence of hypertension? So like in other words, do you feel as though the factor has that much of an effect on hypertension?
I'm not sure, actually. I'm not a hypertension expert by any means, so I'm not sure how much sleep quality and stress in turn affect blood pressure. It probably does somewhat. I will tell you that there's associations with obesity and with obstructive sleep apnea can cause some problems, and that leads to poor sleep quality. But I don't know directly of a very clear association between poor sleep and high blood pressure. When people don't.
There you have it, folks. Amazing.
Thank you so much for
You're
having
welcome.
Yeah,
This was a lot of fun.